Hello or welcome to TraceCloud. In this video, we talk about how you can easily identify missed requirements. With that, let's quickly jump into TraceCloud, and I'm already in a project. So the idea of a missed requirement is normally when you're working in a kind of a siloed requirements management system where you're collecting your requirements in an Excel file or tracking things. If your project is kind of large, globally distributed, spans over a long term, identifying what are the things that are missing as the project is completing is almost always a challenge. If it's a small project, it's doable. If you're trying to figure out at the overall project level, might be it's doable. But if you have multiple releases and you want to track who owns different aspects of the work that is not being executed by a downstream team, those kinds of challenges become a little more complex. So, with that, let's see what TraceCloud can do to help you. If you have been following the videos, you have probably have noticed that when you import requirements into TraceCloud, you have the ability to connect those requirements to other requirements. For example, in this example, I have a business requirement that is tied to a release, and it has further downstream functional requirements. You can always click on this tree. We call this a trace map. It gives you a visual relationship between a business requirement and a release and the functional requirements. And you can kind of ask this to show the kind of attributes to those requirements. You have a little more detail here now that are attached to different requirement types. Or you could say, well, show me all the comments and collaboration that has taken place on these requirements, or show me the description too, so you can get a lot more details about that. But the idea here is this visually indicates relationship between the business requirement, its upstream objects and downstream objects, and you can continue to follow the chain up and down to see where this leads to, right? In this example, you can see that this business requirement had a functional requirement, which in turn has its own test cases and test results, right? And because TraceCloud is kind of an adaptive system, it doesn't hard code you into these requirement types. If you're building an aircraft, you could say, well, I have avionics requirements, I have manufacturing requirements, and the same model works in the same concept. But the idea here is how can you identify the dangling requirements? So in this example, if I'm looking at this picture, I would expect functional requirement 295 to be dangling. That is, when this release gets completed and this business requirement is coming into completion, all this work will get done, but this functional requirement, it may not get tested and executed downstream because there's nobody really working on that. So how do you get a report that kind of shows that information? So let's look into that. One thing TraceCloud does is wherever you are looking at objects, you see this table called the status bar. If you see the word D, that means that object is dangling, period, right? So for example, we follow the same format no matter where you go. For example, if I look at my left-hand scroll bar here, you can see the letter D, that means those are all dangling. No work is being downstream for those objects. At the same time, right, I could be looking at any folder. Let's say I'm looking at this business requirements folder. I could quickly click on the folder metrics, and it tells me how many objects in this folder. There are 62 objects in this folder, out of which 39 are dangling. These are the ones that there's no functional requirement or downstream work being done, right? Or I could be looking at my functional requirements, and I could simply go to folder metrics. It will tell me there are 56 functional requirements in this folder, out of which there are 49 that are dangling. Or if I go to this bulk edit subfolder inside functional requirements, you could see I have 22 or 23 total requirements, of which 20 of them are dangling. So these reports are built into TraceCloud, so you can easily identify, say at a folder level, show me the stuff that is not being done. Okay, now you have organized your project in such a way that you may have a release that is spanning work across multiple requirement types and folders. So in that case, it's as simple as you go to your release, you click on the release metrics tab out here. And what this says is, well, I can kind of build the traceability relationship that shows me the relationship between this release and all the work that's being done across the project. And for that, I can go in and focus on traceability and tell you how many objects of different type are dangling. For example, in this release, I know when this release gets completed, there are 38 business requirements that won't get executed because nobody's working on them. Or I have 16 functional requirements that will never get tested because there are no test cases coming to them. Or I have I don't know, a test case that doesn't have a test result attached to it. So these are all clickable links. I can click on this and get to the problem space and focus on that. But the takeaway here is at a release level, you can easily identify where the work is dangling. So we talked about how you can track dangling work at a folder level and a release level, but every requirement in TraceCloud has the concept of an owner. Okay, so there's this one person who owns that object. So when that individual typically goes to his homepage, his or her homepage, and clicks on My Status tab, you should be able to easily see how many objects are there owned by that individual that are dangling. So if every one of your team members puts their hand up and says, yep, I looked at my report, there's nothing that I own that's dangling, then that project is in a good place already. Right? Or if you want an overall project level view, you can always go here and say, well, I really want to look at the project dashboard. And for the entire project, I really want to look at the metrics and make sure I don't have any dangling objects. You could get a project level view of the same problem. Now, if you're paying close attention, you may run into one situation where you say, well, in if I have my project structure where I have releases, business requirements, mechanical requirements, I don't know, some other complex requirement types. If I think of this as a chain, there has to be something that's dangling at the bottom of this chain. Not everything can have a requirement, then you'll never kind of stop. So, how do you prevent, I would say, reporting stuff that is dangling, which should be dangling, as something that is kind of in a false state? So if you go to the configure project and when you go to manage object types, you have the flexibility of defining whether something should be reported as a dangling or not. So in my example, my test results are the bottom of my food chain. They will always be dangling. I don't want them to be reported as dangling, even though they are, because that's the nature of that particular type of beast. So I can flag it as no, because in that case, even though they're dangling, they won't be reported. You have a similar concept for orphans too. For example, I may look at my release objects and say, well, these are the top of the pile. They won't trace up to anything else. They'll always be orphan. Please don't ding me for that. And you can set it to no here. So that is how you can actually track which objects are I would say dangling in a particular folder or in an ownership space or a release or a project. Now, you can also run more complex reports, like, for example, I'm looking at this and I want to run a report. In this report, I want to apply specific filters. Say, for example, I want to find all requirements that have an impact to customer, yes, but are also dangling. And I should be able to run this complex reports and get this kind of a more narrow data set uh, where you can apply filters based on attributes, but still find objects that are dangling. And that way you can go ahead and take action or generate a report for your customers. Hope that helps. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at support@tracecloud.com. We will be able to set up